after 4 years of the Trump administration's America First unilateral approach to foreign policy, U.S. President-elect Joe Biden promises to return America to its more traditional role on the world stage. But what changes will Biden make to U.S. foreign policy? Will he return to the multilateralist agenda last pursued by President Obama? And how will he handle America's relationships with its allies? And will China-U.S. relations improve? To answer these questions, I'm joined today by Michael O'Halloran, Senior Fellow and Director of Research for the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings Institution, Dr. Zhao Hai, Research Fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and Paul Hakinos, journalist and author. That is our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Zhong Shi in Beijing. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Why don't we start broadly about how Joe Biden's foreign policies will take shape, who will be shaping them, and just how different they will be from Mr. Trump's. Mr. Hakinos, I want to start with you. This is what we know and probably will happen. Joe Biden says he will rejoin the Paris Agreement on climate change, revive the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, and that is if Tehran returns to compliance, reaffirm U.S. military commitment to NATO, rejoin the WHO, and work with other countries to fight COVID-19. It's a long list. What do you think will prioritize that list for Joe Biden?
That's hard to say, but what's clear is that he'll be pursuing his foreign policy again through the institutions. He'll be rejoining those institutions and trying to pick up where the Obama administration left off. To be sure, a Biden foreign policy will also be America first. American foreign policy has always been American first, but it won't be, like the Trump administration, America alone. The problem, though, is that we have a different world now than we had 4 years ago, and it's going to be impossible simply to restore or resume the Obama-era policies. We have, for example, he's going to be looking probably, by the end of next year at a post-COVID global landscape, the economic situation. There will probably be a recession, a deep global recession. There's also, since 4 years ago, the climate change has heated up on many levels, and there's an international youth movement of millions pushing on that topic. Also, what will be different is that there is now a broad public consensus in the United States that interventions like those in Iraq and Afghanistan are not wanted, they don't work, they cost Americans a total of $4 trillion, and nearly 7,000 American lives were lost. So we're looking at a world that's different, and the question then is, how different will those policies be? Obviously, the foreign policy team that Biden has put together is almost exclusively made up of Obama-era officials. So the question then, which way are we going to go now? There are a lot of question marks.
You don't have to yell America first to have America's best interests at heart. And make no mistake, whoever is in the White House will defend and safeguard America's interests. Now, before we proceed, let's take a look at some of the comments we've gathered on social media about this topic. And this one from Ryan Struick. Apparently, it is a quote from former Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, which says, when President Joe Biden and his national security team begin to reevaluate U.S. foreign policy, we hope they will quickly revise the national security strategy to eliminate America first. Mr. Zhao Hai, what do you make of that comment?
Well, I think because when you say America first, it's very puzzling to the world. Which America? Because apparently Trump, in Trump's mind, he has not have all the Americans in his mind. He is very specifically catering to his base. And now the America is very much divided along racial lines, along different income lines, different genders. So after the current American election 2020, we've discovered that America is divided more than ever before. You have over 73 million people voted for Trump and 80 million voted for Biden. So when you talk about Biden continuous America First policy, also the question is which America, what America? So I think at this point, probably abandoning America First is a good idea. Biden needs to redefine his foreign policy, find a new footing for his foreign policy. And at this point, from the appointees currently for the future Biden administration, looks like that the unilateralism will be gone and multilateralism will be restored. And probably his policy is going to be pursued with America's allies.
And Mr. O'Halloran, the understanding is that Joe Biden will most likely do away with this slogan, this catchy phrase of America First, but he will find his own way to ensure that it is the America he protects. How will Biden's liberal internationalism contrast with the America First unilateralism pursued by President Trump, in your opinion?
Well, first, greetings, and thanks for having me on. And I think you and some of my colleagues on the panel are correct to say that America First may disappear as a slogan, but it's important to remember every country puts its own interests first in foreign affairs, and every American president prioritizes U.S. interests when making foreign policy. And so, in that sense, there won't be a change. And by the way, there doesn't have to be an immediate revision to the national security strategy. It's understood that when there's a new president, there's a new philosophy. National security strategies are not binding documents in any case. So there doesn't have to be any January 21st revision to that. But Joe Biden will do some things very quickly. Going back to your very first question, he can do all these things simultaneously. He can rejoin the Paris Accord. He can rejoin the WHO. He can perhaps even indicate a willingness to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal, although that may be a little more complicated. But he can do all those things the first day he's in office. You know, there are some issues where it's going to take time to figure out a new policy. For example, towards China, where we know that the U.S. consensus on engagement of the traditional sort was breaking down even at the end of the Obama administration. So again, going back to my colleague and his first answer to your question, the world has changed. And U.S. thinking about China was changing already 5 and 10 years ago. So on that one, it's going to take a lot longer than January 21st to figure out the way forward.
Mr. Hakinos, when you said just now that the Biden administration will pick up where Obama left, help us understand why he said his presidency will not be a third Obama term, because first of all, as you pointed out, many of his cabinet picks are Obama-era officials. And then people constantly look for clues on where he stands from his positions back in the day as vice president under Obama. How do we understand where he wants to continue the Obama-era policies and where he wants his new ones?
Well, he hasn't been very clear on that. So we were going to, they think they're going to be dealing with it as they go along, making up policy. I don't see any clear expression of how this is going to be different. Joe Biden has said that there has to be fresh thinking on all of the issues that we've mentioned. When it comes to the transatlantic relationship in Europe, for example, I mean, there also things have changed. It's going to be relatively easy for President Biden to reach out. He knows the people on the other side of the Atlantic. He's been working with them for decades, and they'll be very happy here in Europe to see a friendly face in the White House. But Europe, too, has changed. The primary institution for transatlantic cooperation is NATO, which is really a Cold War era institution that has been revamped again and again to try to catch up with the present, but it hasn't really been able to. And within NATO, you have conflicts that you didn't have even 5 years ago with illiberal regimes like Poland and in Hungary and Turkey. You have a situation in the Eastern Mediterranean where Turkey and Greece, both NATO members, are at loggerheads. You also have a Europe which now doesn't and can't trust the United States like it did. In 4 years from now, maybe a Republican will be president again and throw the whole relationship off. So French President Macron and Angela Merkel, they have been working toward a more a European-based security approach. I don't think they've gotten that far yet, but that will change as well. The United States will have to look at Europe as a peer, as an equal, and so that's going to be a big difference.
Mr. Zhao, let me come to you now. No president will want to look or act or be remembered, be regarded as a repeat of his predecessor, but because of the people Biden handpicked to form the cabinet, his inner circle, people he will rely on to form many of the policies, foreign policies going forward, people compare and contrast him with Barack Obama. In what way, Mr. Zhao, do you think the Biden administration will resemble that of the Obamas?
Well, I think importantly that the Biden administration will be resembling the previous Obama administration in terms of style. The means of conducting business, particularly foreign policy, in a more nuanced, more reasonable way to deal with other countries, including China. I think it's very important, first of all, the America First kind of foreign policy will remain as an undercurrent, and that will compete with the Biden administration, limiting their choices. So I think if you look at the future Biden foreign policy, if there is a fundamental difference from the previous Obama administration, is that they need to lower their expectations and be more pragmatic and more precise. So at this point, for instance, it's quite difficult to reinvent the TPP or TTIP with Asia-Pacific countries and with European countries like Obama did. So at this point, they need to revive some part of the alliance. However, they cannot return to the previous years because over the years, things have changed. There's been a big change in EU and also in East Asia. So I think overall, they need to review the current situation and find out in a smart way how to proceed, how to move forward to repair some of the relationship. However, also spend a lot more time focusing on domestic issues like COVID-19, like economic recovery and racial relations. So I think the Biden administration's attention will be divided, and they need to have more pragmatic and realistic foreign policy goals at this point.
Mr. O'Hanlon, can I get your thoughts also on this topic? And let's also talk about Biden's pick for Secretary of State Antony Blinken. What do you make of that choice? We know that Blinken grew up partly in France, speaks French. What do you make of that choice for Secretary of State?
Well, I know Antony Blinken quite well. He's a very smart and accomplished individual. He's also a very good listener. You know, we talk about multilateralism as a principle, but Mr. Blinken is multilateralist and consensus-oriented in his way of thinking. I don't mean to suggest that he's timid or irresolute, but I do mean to argue that he is, in fact, very good at reaching out, very good at understanding the points of view of other countries, of other players and actors in the American political system. He's a very strong choice. I would not describe him as a boisterous or disruptive personality. He's much calmer. He's in the tradition of sort of the stereotypical diplomat who's,
but is he the type of restorationist that many say, is part of the new Biden cabinet, meaning that he will want things to return as much to the pre-2016 world as possible?
Yeah, I know this framing that my colleague Tom Wright has introduced. I think it's a useful framing conceptually. I'm not sure it's all that useful as a predictive mechanism for someone like Blinken, because Blinken cannot afford to fall into just a restorationist or a reformist camp. He's really got to take issues one by one. And he's a smart enough guy to know the world has changed. I mentioned earlier how much things have changed on China policy. But even on, let's say, Iran policy, where I argued that, in fact, Biden could try to return towards the Iran nuclear deal of 2015 in the early weeks of his presidency. Even there, as you know, the deal is set to begin expiring in 2023. So you can't just be a restorationist, even on the Iran nuclear deal. And so, you can philosophically be in favor of alliances and NATO, for example. But as our colleague just mentioned from Europe, the world changes, and so NATO has to keep changing too. So I don't really feel the restorationist framing could be a good predictor of anybody in the Biden team.
Gotcha. Let's talk about China, shall we, gentlemen? Mr. Zhao, I want to start with you.
Actually, I'd like to...
People have been obsessed with the choice of word where Biden said China is more of a competitor, not a threat. Does that difference in wording truly reflect what Biden thinks and where he will go with China?
I think so. I think over the years, Biden's view of China also changed because the situation on the ground has changed. First of all, I think a restorationist kind of definition of Blinken is still working because I think there are some interesting meaning to it, because Biden, in his writing in foreign policy, in foreign affairs, he said he wanted to make America lead again. And I think in many ways that his foreign policy overall, overarching sort of doctrine will be restoring American leadership in the world. In that way, I think he understands that the U.S. China relations has moved towards from engagement to competition already. And in some respect, the Trump administration towards China is moving toward more confrontation. And Biden wanted to move to a more smart sort of competition. And China also stated that China wanted to have a sort of cooperation mixed with competition in some area. So overall, I think this notion or this conceptualization of competition between the two great powers will continue, and Biden's administration and Biden's foreign policy would have to accept this overall situation and making their foreign policy accordingly.
Mr. Hakinos, some say that a grave mistake that the Trump administration made was, while containing China, it alienated its other allies, traditional allies, for example, Europeans, and allies here in Asia, Japan and South Korea, where they could have, come together and formed a united front against China. Now, with Biden in the White House, should Beijing look out for a possible united front as Washington seeks to restore that alliance around the world?
Honestly, I don't see that. I think the way that Mr. Blinken, for example, talks about American leadership and American exceptionalism, the United States as a city on a hill, I think those days are long gone. The United States does not have the economic power that it did in the post-war decades. It doesn't have the moral authority either, especially not after 4 years of Mr. Trump. I think that China is going to be one of Mr. Biden's biggest challenges. He said, we're going after China the wrong way. He says that he wants to get China to play by the rules. There's so many differences with China on so many different fronts. It's going to be very difficult, and I don't think there's going to be a immediate reversal of all Trump-era policies. But yet I think that there's a possibility for this. I mean, I think that there is now a possibility to change America's approach toward China and American foreign policy in general. We've seen that this interventionist, this liberal internationalism and the way that the United States has intervened around the world, it doesn't work, it's not popular, and it really, I am disappointed when I hear Mr. Blinken say something like, one of the biggest mistakes of the Obama administration was not to intervene in Syria. I mean, we saw how difficult it is, and we looked at what happened in Libya. I mean, I can't imagine that an American intervention in Syria would have worked. I think it would have left the United States in an even worse position than it is now. But to get back to China, I don't think there's. I'd like to see the United States and the other countries you mentioned sit down with China and try to get things on a better track. I mean, we don't want another Cold War or a hot war either. We saw so much money and time wasted during the Cold War decades. let's try to get things off on a better foot. There's a chance now for a break. There's a chance for a new start. And that's what I'd like to see. I don't want to see a front against China. I'd like to see China cooperate more with the United States and the European Union.
Mr. O'Hanlon, not an immediate reversal of the Trump-era policy. That seems to be the consensus right now. So when it comes to Biden on China, is it going to be the same diagnosis or similar diagnosis, but with different treatments? How different will these treatments be? What will they look like?
I think China policy will be substantially different, although it will also be different than Obama first or second term. I think it will be tougher in some ways, for example, on high technology, on intellectual property, and on 5G sorts of issues, tougher than Obama had been. But I think it will be more selective. I think there'll be more care and precision in where the toughness happens. And I agree there'll be no effort to contain China or to build a fundamentally adversarial relationship or to try to bring NATO, Japan, and Korea into an anti-China coalition broadly defined. I don't think any of that will happen. But I do expect that on some of the issues I just mentioned, that there will be much more toughness than there was in the first term. And Biden, excuse me, in the Obama terms, both of the Obama terms. And I think also Biden himself has indicated he's going to take a little time to figure out how to change the Trump tariff policies towards China. I don't expect that he'll keep them indefinitely, but he has indicated, I think just yesterday in an interview with Tom Friedman of the New York Times, that he may be a little bit patient in figuring out the next approach. One quick word on Syria, because I hear my colleague in Europe concerned about Mr. Blinken's comments. I've also spoken and listened to Mr. Blinken on Syria. It's not as if he wants to have big U.S. interventions in conflicts like that. I think he's just an honest enough person and a thoughtful enough person to know that the tragedy that unfolded in Syria was deeply regrettable. And to the extent the United States, acting with others, could have used limited amounts of diplomatic, economic, and maybe military power to try to reduce and mitigate the worst of the humanitarian suffering, that would have been preferable.
I hear you.
I think that's all he said. I would not overreact or overinterpret that kind of a comment.
And Mr. Zhao, talking about cooperation, if China and the United States were to move forward, in what areas are we most likely to see they make headways? And some have said trade, but then Joe Biden has made it clear that he will not immediately lift the tariffs put in by Donald Trump.
Well, first of all, let me say, before we getting into the areas of cooperation, I have to say that the #1 problem between the United States and China is mistrust and misrepresentation of China's strategic intentions. Because in recent documents produced by the Trump administration and also the U.S. Congress, they continue to misinterpret or misrepresent China's strategic intentions, saying that not only China's revisionist to the current global system, but also China wanted to pursue global hegemony. This is, I think, fundamentally wrong to represent China's intentions globally, and therefore, coming from this understanding of China's intentions, the prognosis is wrong, then the medicine or the fix is also wrong. So I think along this line, if the U.S. moving not only from the Trump administration, but if Biden's administration accept that preconditions and the definition of China's intentions, then they will continue on this wrong path of sort of competing in the wrong area with China. So I think in many areas, if China and the U.S. can come up with agreements mutual understanding, then there will be expansion of cooperation areas instead of shrinking areas. And if there's no mutual understanding, then even if starting with cooperation, mistrust will sort of ruin the future possibility of deepening cooperations. So back to the areas of cooperation, I think there are a number of areas of cooperation. For instance, COVID-19 is the #1 threat to both countries. We have common interest to work together on the global stage. If the United States return to WHO, then it should work with China instead of pointing fingers at China. And secondly, I think in terms of economic recovery after 2008, China and the United States have worked together, both bilaterally and in a multilateral platform like G20. And also, I think on climate change, China can definitely work with the U.S., pushing forward the agenda of Paris Accord. So in many areas, that if both countries have trust and both top leaders have agreements, then we can have much more cooperations in the future.
Mr. O'Halloran, you mentioned that Biden will be selective when it comes to tackling China-related issues. Are there sectors or aspects of the bilateral relationship do you see the two sides first engage each other in? Where can progress come from?
Well, I'll give one example, which is in military competition. And as you know, there was a great deal of concern in recent years, and there still is, over certain developments in the Western Pacific. China and Japan contesting over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, for example. China's building up of artificial islands and then putting military assets on them in the South China Sea. China claiming that the South China Sea is effectively covered by the so-called 9-dash line, and that China has some degree of sovereign control over those waters, which was a big challenge to the global order. I feel at this point we've reached the beginnings of a new normal where things are a little more stable. I don't think China is going to attack a Senkaku Diaoyu Island. I don't think China is really going to enforce its claims to the South China Sea waterways. And I think we can live and learn to disagree over certain of the disputed islands. And I think that kind of new normal has been emerging over the last few years under both Obama and Trump. So on that issue, I don't really think we need some big new breakthrough. I think we are essentially learning that the Western Pacific is a more complicated strategic zone where there are now effectively two military superpowers. But the good news is those military superpowers do not fundamentally disagree about most of the rules of the road. There are still potential hotspots, maybe Taiwan being issue number one. But I think I feel a little better, a little calmer about how this relationship is evolving. So that's an example of where you could imagine that things are improving somewhat. I could give others in the trade area, but again, I think the point here is that there will be specific disagreements on certain high-tech and intellectual property issues, but not as much of a fundamental disagreement across the board.
What elements of the pivot to Asia, Mr. O'Halloran strategy, will we see with the Biden administration?
Well, I think that the pivot or rebalance, such as it is, really just amounts to somewhat more military attention to the region. Not a radical breakthrough, because we still have military and security concerns in Europe and the Middle East, and we have not dramatically enlarged the military to begin with. So we don't have that much more capability for the Asia Pacific. But we still have a very powerful military, and its budget is $740 billion a year. That's enormous. So there's a lot of capability there. Diplomatically, you may see some top people appointed with Asia interests. But again, if you look at the team of Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken and Avril Haines, for example, these are people who have more experience probably in Europe and the Middle East. And so we're not really seeing a radical shift. And the rebalance is maybe the right word, because it suggests a more modest change. The big question is, as mentioned earlier, TPP. Is there a way to get the United States back into something like a TPP framework? And there the answer is, I don't know.
I'm afraid that's all the time we have on the broadcast. Gentlemen, thank you so much for this discussion. I've enjoyed it and learned so much. Paul Hakinos, Zhao Hai, and Michael O'Halloran, thank you so much for your expertise. And thank you for watching the dialogue today on Zhongshi in Beijing.